The bell was the first to die. Its final toll rang hollow across the valley, then broke, not from war or thunder but the slow decay of absence. Now it lay half buried in chapel ruin, its tongue shattered, its bronze face flecked with moss and memory. In better seasons it marked lauds, vespers, feast days, funerals. But now time passed without sound. On the far edge of the ruined village, past collapsed roofs and doorways nailed shut with iron crosses, a woman moved through the ash-soaked mud with the hush of snowfall. Her name was Thera. She wore no robes of station. No sigil, no seal. Only a cloak stitched from pelts and a cloth veil tied with twine. Her hands, wrapped in oiled linen, held bundles of bitterness, dried toad skin, vinegar-soaked rag, lavender hard as bone. She passed the lime pit, where limbs protruded like roots clawing their way back to life. The men no longer buried. They heaped. Dragged bodies by the wrists, white-eyed and bloated, stacked like broken offerings to a god that no longer answered. Thera did not look away. She had helped once, lifting a child whose mouth still moved in death as if whispering to the flies. She had learned to move without trembling. Thera once wore the pale robes of St. Jourdain's infirmary. She lit candles for the dying. She washed fevered flesh with thyme and snowmelt. She stitched wounds with thread soaked in wine. She hummed psalms under her breath, not for the patient but for herself. One by one the sisters fell. One by one they were buried beneath the herb garden. One by one the songs ceased, but she remained. Her hut stood alone now, tucked between two oaks that had not yet dropped their dead leaves. Inside, herbs hung from every rafter: rue, garlic, catmint, fennel, marjoram, nettle. A rusted crucifix leaned against the hearth. Smoke curled up from a shallow fire of damp reeds. The scent inside was thick: boiled urine, goat's fat, soot, crushed lavender, and something sourer still, the scent of old flesh and older fear. The boy had arrived 3 nights ago, wrapped in a sheepskin, eyes flicking at shadows as though they were names. His mother had collapsed beside the stone bridge, her body curled like a question, her mouth full of blood and blackened teeth. The villagers left her where she fell. No one dared touch the dead anymore. But Thera had carried the boy. She did not ask his name. He would not speak it. Tonight, his breath came shallow in the basket beside the fire, his lips cracked, his hands clenched like claws. Thera stirred the pot: snowmelt, wormwood, 3 drops of turpentine, and the soft marrow of a goat's knuckle. It hissed when stirred, a smell like rusted iron rising into the rafters. She dipped her fingers into the mix, smoothed it across a scrap of linen, and pressed it gently to the boy's chest. His skin was hot, the way stone gets hot before it cracks. Then, with a clean shard of bone, she marked a cross upon his brow. Not holy, not sacred, just memory. The echo of a time when someone still tried. The flicker of a candle danced along the far shelf. There, resting in dust, sat a reliquary, small, rusted, its hinge long broken. Inside it once held the hair of a saint. Now it held a ribbon, faded red, torn from the dress of a child she had not saved. She stepped to the boy's side and knelt. The candlelight caught the curve of his cheek. She reached out, brushed away the sweat that pooled like dew, and whispered his name, the one his mother had muttered in her final breath. Geraint. Not a prayer. Not a charm. Just a name. Anchored into the dark, like a thread tied to a drowning hand. Outside, wind scraped across the wooden slats like claws, and far off wolves called, not hungry but curious. The world had quieted. Even the birds had fled. Thera did not sleep. She sat with her knees to her chest and listened to the boy's breathing. It rasped and paused, rasped and paused. Each silence stretched too long. But then it would return. She counted them. Each breath was a defiance. A fragile holy thing. When dawn came, it brought no light. Only a pale smear across the horizon. Snow began again, soft, soundless, infinite. Thera rose stiffly, added crushed bark to the coals, and drank the dregs of last night's infusion, bitter enough to sting her tongue. The boy opened one eye. Just barely. She met his gaze. Still here, she said, barely more than a whisper. And in that moment so was he. She moved to the door, braced her back, and opened it an inch. Snow whipped in sideways. The village was still, not dead, not alive. Just paused. Held between frost and fire, faith and forgetting. Somewhere down the hill, a bell rope swayed in the wind, though no hand pulled it. The bell would not ring again. But the rope still moved. Thera pulled her cloak tighter. She would leave soon, go west where the abbey fire still burned and smoke still meant soup. But not yet. Not until the boy could walk. Not until the memory of care had set deeper than the scar. and as she turned back to close the door, the wind caught the edge of the candle's flame, bending it low, but not out. A sign perhaps, or nothing at all. But in a time where miracles had turned to ash, even a flicker was enough to follow. Rain fell like needles over the infirmary roof, each drop a cold whisper against the hollowed timbers above. It ran in threads down the warped beams, traced the seams between the stones, and pooled beneath straw pallets too thin to keep the dying dry. Water soaked cloth, skin, and breath alike, cleansing nothing, only joining what decay had already begun. Beneath one such steady leak, Brother Isambard crouched low, sleeves rolled past the elbow, arms slick with a red-black sheen of blood and vinegar. His hands trembled only slightly as he worked, more from exhaustion than fear. Before him lay a man, face waxen, eyes turned inward. His body bloated with rot, a single weeping sore spilling down the ribs like ink down parchment. Isambard pressed a strip of wool, soaked in soot and ox bile, against it. The wound hissed faintly like a dying flame. The man made no sound. There was no pain left in him, only heat and breath and the faint echo of what once was soul. A cage of meat, swaying on its hinges. Isambard's fingers were not born for this. Once, they had been groomed to trace the arcs of Latin verse across calfskin vellum, to copy psalms in gold leaf and red ink, each letter a prayer. But the scriptorium had fallen silent seasons ago. The scribes scattered. The ink dried in its wells. Now, his tools were bone needles, grim poultices, dull knives, and murmured charms passed down from a grandmother who spoke with bees and burned herbs in clay bowls. The abbey itself had become a body. Once a place of chants and supplication, it now stank of wine dregs, urine, and boiled roots. The psalters had been torn, their pages tucked beneath the fevered as crude bedding. The altar was no longer a holy threshold. It held jars of mustard seed, saltpeter, crushed pearl, and a row of bloodletting blades dulled from their service. The chalices had been hidden or stolen. No communion remained, save for the sharing of suffering. In the corner, beyond a linen partition, a child coughed in gasps, each breath rattling like wet bellows in a dying forge. Her cheeks were scarlet with fever, eyes glassy and unseeing. Isambard crossed to her quietly, drew the curtain across with a soft tug. Not to spare her sight from the dying, but to shield the dying from her. Even death, he thought, deserved one last silence. He washed his hands in a basin of stale beer, the foam long gone. A flicker of rosemary floated on the surface, added days ago in desperate hope of cleansing. He dried his hands on a strip of linen, once a relic, embroidered with the name of a saint whose bones were rumored to cure plague. The thread had faded. The miracles too. Outside, the world festered beneath the storm. The grave pit steamed in the rain, where lime hissed like serpent's breath as it met flesh. The scent rose in layers, smoke, piss, rosemary crushed beneath hurried boots, and the sour metallic tang of rotted mouths. Somewhere down the hill a cartwheel creaked, or broke, or simply groaned beneath another pile of what could no longer be saved. There was no weeping now, not even from the mothers. Isambard moved from cot to cot, changing bandages, sprinkling vinegar, rubbing salves into hot skin that blistered beneath his touch. There were no cures. He knew this. He had known it since the first blackened tongue, the first man who bled from his ears and prayed in 3 languages at once. But still, the hands worked. If not to heal, then to witness. A woman clutched his arm as he passed, her fingers clawed and cold, her lips whispering something he could not make out. Her eyes were fogged, not with fever, but with something older. She died mid-sentence. He pried her fingers free one by one and pulled the cloth over her face. No scream. No candle. Just the gesture. He moved back to the central table where the instruments lay wrapped in oilskin. He checked each blade, not for sharpness but for rust. Infection was now no worse than the plague itself. He breathed shallowly through his mouth, though the mask of rosemary and crushed mint beneath his veil no longer kept the sickness from clinging to his tongue. Rain tapped against the window slits like pleading hands. Distant thunder rolled low over the hills, not violent, just tired. Like the sky itself had grown weary of witnessing. He reached for the candle. A tallow stub twisted at the base, its wick made of frayed wool. He struck the flint 3 times before it caught, a small, irregular flame trembling as if uncertain whether to live. He set it on the table beside the bowl of soot and bile, beside the jawbone used for scraping pustules, beside the psalter now stained and unreadable. The flame did not cast away the darkness. It merely carved a space inside it. A single breath's width of defiance. And then he whispered, not a prayer nor scripture but something older. The words his grandmother had muttered to the dead bees in summer, to the frost-bitten lambs in winter, to the wind when it would not let the fire catch. Words meant not to cure but to remind the world that someone still remained. "I see you," he said. "One more bandage. One more breath." This was not medicine. This was memory kept alive by repetition. He paused by the door as lightning split the sky, illuminating the far ridge, where the next village was said to be burning. Not with fire but fever. No monks there now. No priests. Only bones and the soft crackle of skin against straw. Isambard closed the door gently, sealing out the rain. Behind him, the child stirred once, then stilled again. He would sleep sitting up tonight, if the storm allowed. And though the candle guttered low, its flame curved gently toward the child's cot, as if remembering her name even when she could not speak it. In a world where healing had abandoned its faithful, sometimes the cure was not to fix, but to remain, to keep watch, to stay when all else had gone. The apothecary's door groaned with age but remained unopened, sealed by dust, silence, and fear. Moss crept over the threshold like green fingers reclaiming what the living had abandoned. Rain tapped once upon the sagging eaves, then ceased as if unwilling to trespass further. Inside the air pressed in close, thick woolen, warm in the wrong ways. It smelled of myrrh, clove, vinegar, old lavender, and beneath it all, the dark musk of something turning, not flesh, not herb, but memory-grown mold. Light slanted through a cracked skylight, dimmed by soot and years of breath held too long. The room was a reliquary of forgotten science. Rows of glass vials lined the far wall like sentinels, each labeled in a hand once proud, now faded to whispers. Hemlock, arsenic, treacle, angelica. Dust settled where labels once shimmered. Some bottles were half-filled, others sealed tight with beeswax blackened by age. A few had cracked in the cold. Their contents bled slowly into the shelves like ink across parchment. In the center, beneath a tattered curtain of flax, stood Isabet. Her hands, gloved in parchment stitched from pages of failed prescriptions, moved slowly, deliberately. She traced formulas into a sheet of leather stretched taut over a slate slab, each mark a memory of what had worked or nearly worked or failed with grace. She no longer brewed for nobles. Once she perfumed the robes of the Lady of Montfort, violets steeped in olive oil, rose petals crushed with orange rind. That was before the rot began. Before the nobles stopped visiting. Before perfume became a sacrament too sweet for a dying world. Now she crushed beetles with vinegar and soot, whispered over pots of boiling roots and placed leeches by candlelight. Her mouth remained hidden beneath a veil soaked in herbs and salt tears, protection, penance, or both. She believed not in miracles but in patterns. Not in angels but in symptoms. On the floor beside her, a girl lay bound in strips of linen, her limbs twitching against the fever's grip. Her eyes, glassy and wide, turned to the ceiling with a gaze that pierced nothing. Her skin bore the bruise of heat, flushed too red to last. Isabet knelt beside her, slow as ritual, and reached for a coin, small silver worn to softness. She pressed it gently between the girl's teeth, not to stop the seizures, but in case the crossing came. Payment for the ferryman, Sharon, if the old tale still mattered. Or perhaps just to remind death that someone still counted the cost. She whispered words in Occitan, the old language of southern valleys where she'd first learned the craft. Words older than scripture. Names of plants and spirits once burned at the pyre. They were not spells. They were scaffolding for belief. For something to cling to when blood turned black and breath came hard. A kettle hissed nearby. From it, she poured a slow stream of decoction, licorice root darkened with crushed toadstone and clove, down the girl's throat. The child did not choke. Her throat worked barely. Isabet laid her palm on the girl's chest, feeling for rhythm. Was there. Dim but pulsing. Sometimes, she thought, the cure lay not in the root or the brew but in the act of staying. Of staying near when others fled. Of pressing warmth into dying skin not because it would heal, but because it once did. Outside, smoke drifted low over the cobbled lanes. The bishop's men had begun their purge again, fire and ash delivered as mercy. A final sacrament to those who might carry the stain. Homes were burning. Quietly. As if not to wake the dead within. The apothecary's windows had been shuttered for days. No one knocked. They feared what lay inside. They feared the woman who whispered in lost tongues and boiled bloodroot by moonlight. But Isabet feared nothing now save the forgetting. In the corner, a rat scurried across a basket of figs turned sour. It paused, sniffed, and vanished into the hollow wall. Isabet did not stir. Death had many forms, vermin, fever, shadows beneath the nails. So did defiance. A leaf. A flame. A woman who stayed. She reached for a slender stick of wormwood and lavender, twisted and bound with crimson thread. She lit it from the hearth, watching the smoke rise in coiling ribbons. It drifted toward the ceiling, curling like a prayer too proud to be spoken aloud. The scent cut through the staleness, sharp, wholly bitter. The girl moaned again, her arms falling limp. Isabet leaned close, brushed a strand of damp hair from the child's brow, and kissed her forehead through the veil. The gesture meant nothing. Or everything. She did not speak. There were no more promises to make. A sound, distant, low, echoed from the streets beyond. Bells? No, not anymore. Just the iron clatter of a cart wheel or the final groan of a falling beam. She rose slowly and returned to the table, where hundreds of vials waited. Some clear, some clouded with sediment, some empty but never discarded. Each one had held something sacred once. Blood, hope, error. She touched a small bottle of theriac, once rare as gold. Now diluted, useless. Still she left it upright. There was dignity in not discarding what once mattered. Outside the fires would come. Eventually they always did. The bishop's men might tear the door from its hinges. They might find the girl alive. Or not. They might find Isabet seated, hands folded, eyes closed. Or working still. But in that hour within those four walls, healing still meant trying. Not hoping. Just refusing to surrender. The smoke from the wormwood twisted again, brushing the rafters with slow intention. And Isabet whispered to the girl, not a cure, not a blessing, just a name. That too could be medicine. The wind came low and wet across the bog, dragging mist behind it like torn cloth. Trees leaned with it, their trunks warped and bowed as though in mourning or prayer. Crows hung like ink stains against a slate sky, and somewhere far off, a curlew screamed high, thin, and without echo. At the edge of this silence, where the land forgot how to be solid, a roof of moss and sod sank into the earth as if trying to hide. Smoke curled weakly from a hole in its peak. Not warm, not inviting, but alive. Just barely. Inside the smell was thick, not foul, not clean, but layered. Damp straw, bloodroot, salt, boiled marrow. The air clung to the skin. In the dimness, Mela moved like a shadow that had learned to breathe. She ground deer antler and dried yarrow root with slow precision. Each turn of the pestle echoed faintly, a heartbeat pressed into stone. She did not look up. She did not need to. The bog told her when someone came. Her fingers were worn, cracked, darkened by years of tannin and soot. Her hair was braided back, streaked with white, coarse as flax rope. A crow's skull hung from a leather cord at her throat. Its beak pointed down toward her heart. They called her a witch when they thought she couldn't hear. They crossed themselves when they passed her gate, when they had the strength to pass it. And still they came. They came barefoot through the sucking mud, with breathless infants pressed to their chests, with rags stained in every color of grief. They came with trembling lips and coin hidden in cloth or no coin at all. They came not for miracles but for last things, the last oil, the last warmth, the last hope they dared to speak aloud. At dusk 2 brothers came. One walked. One hung across his back like a limp bundle of meat. The boy's skin was mottled purple, his lips dry and cracked, a smear of blood marking his chin. His eyes fluttered as if unsure whether to stay or leave. Mela said nothing. She reached for a strip of linen soaked in vinegar, laid it across the boy's brow. She placed a smooth toadstone, warm from her palm, against his belly, and from a horn cup poured crushed sage into his mouth. He coughed. Not much. Enough. Leeches were drawn from a bowl of moss-lined clay. She laid them carefully beneath his ribs, where the fever bloomed hottest. The boy whimpered. His brother winced. Mela hummed then, low, steady. A tune without words, carried only by the breath and the bones. A song passed from mothers who never wrote. A song for binding what frayed. The hut darkened. The fire spat once and grew still. The shadows danced against shelves of green-stained glass, beeswax rolls, and dried things that no longer had names. A crow, feet-bound and feather-marked, swayed above the hearth. It turned slowly in the smoke. The brother asked the question they all asked, voice hollow as the bog wind. Will he live? Mela did not turn. She dipped her fingers in a bowl of milk and ash, washed her hands in silence, then poured the grayed water into the coals. The hearth hissed, sharp, sudden like a snake exhaling. Then she spoke, voice old as stone. Some return, she said. Some don't. There was no comfort in the words. But there was truth. And that, too, could be medicine. The brother sat down, eyes heavy. The boy slept. The hut breathed with them. Mela returned to her mortar. The grinding resumed, slow, deliberate. Each turn another heartbeat. Each heartbeat another thread held taut between the living and the not. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the shape of the world. Wolves barked far off, their voices carried through waterlogged reeds. The earth smelled of peat and something older. Inside, she reached for poppy syrup, nettle tincture, and a wax-sealed jar of bear fat soaked in violet. She did not use them yet, but she touched them, as if to say, "You are still needed. Not all hope has burned." She made no charts, kept no books. Her tools were memory, breath, and instinct, and the taste of rot in the air. A finger pressed to the boy's throat. His pulse fluttered, thin, tired, but there. She leaned over him, whispered something into his ear, not in Latin, not in prayer, but in the language of bones and breath. A name perhaps, or a warning, or a map. Then she turned back to the fire. Her back curved with the weight of decades. Her hands never stopped moving. In the shadows, the crow swayed again. And as the flames lowered, casting the room in the color of old blood, Mela lit a new bundle of herbs, thyme, elderflower, and dried marigold petals. Smoke rose, curling along the beams like a question rising toward no god in particular. She closed her eyes, not to rest, but to listen, because healing was never a certainty, only a waiting. And across the bog something shifted, a bird startled, a ripple across the water, a sound that might have been a whisper or a scream, or the world turning, ever so slightly, toward whatever came next. The sky above Brackenwall was the color of old iron, thick, silent, unmoving. Beneath it, smoke hung like mourning cloth, clinging to chimneys and the bones of broken houses. Fire had become a kind of scripture here, anointing the dead, cauterizing the wounds of a town that could no longer weep. In the alleys, where rats scuttled over the footprints of saints and thieves alike, the scent of pitch and burning linen lingered like breath on a dying man's lips. Bodies were not buried. There was no time, no ground left sacred enough. They were burned. Dragged by the ankles through muck that hissed and spat around their limbs, they left behind long ribbons of blood that turned to rust when the wind cooled. The pyres were built high, fed with broken carts, old furniture, anything that would catch. Sometimes the flames sang. Sometimes they screamed. Atop the hill, past the ash-choked paths and shuttered shops, stood the convent, pale and still against the horizon. Its gates remained closed. Not from arrogance. From necessity. They whispered in the village. The sisters inside had found a cure. Or made a pact. With the plague itself, with devils, with forgotten gods. No one knew. No one dared ask. Inside, Sister Elwine hunched over a parchment smudged with soot. Her hands bore the ink stains of repetition, her knuckles raw from lie and prayer. The candle by her elbow flickered against the walls, its wax running like a wound. She dipped her quill in a mixture of wine and rabbit gall, a bitter draught, thin as hope, and wrote. She wrote everything. Not just the names of the sick, but the way they moaned in their sleep, the tint of their breath, the heat of their skin when fever climbed to its peak. She recorded recipes with trembling clarity, crushed emerald in milk, sheep's lung hung over flame until the smoke turned gray, vinegar boiled with wormwood and thyme. Her desk bore no cross now. Only vials. Small glass mouths with labels in trembling Latin. Somnus, venenum, tentatio, sleep, poison, attempt. To others it was witchcraft. To Elwine it was memory. It was duty. In the infirmary the air was warm and rank. Candles smoked along the walls, their wicks blackened with old prayers. Sisters moved like ghosts through the room, each with her task. One stirred a pot of boiled leeches and nettles. Another knelt beside a girl with a burst abscess, humming low, her voice barely audible beneath the crackle of fire. Elwine approached the soldier. He had come from the southern wall, fevered and stammering, with a wound that stank of rot and rain. His skin was waxen, his eyes clouded. He muttered names not his own. His hands clawed at his throat, at the ghosts pressing against his lungs. She opened a vein near his ankle, watching as dark blood spilled into a carved wooden bowl, thick, sluggish, veined with black. She did not bless it. She did not pray. She threw it into the fire. The flames snapped like bones breaking, then quieted. The soldier did not die. Not yet. He groaned, a sound like the wind against old stone. Elwine pressed a cloth soaked in fig and vinegar to his lips. Sleep, she whispered. But what she meant was, survive. The hymns began then, thin voices rising through the rafters like smoke. The sisters sang in Latin, but the words were not for God. They were for the ones in pain. For the ones already gone. They stitched each note into the air as though trying to mend the world with sound. Outside dogs howled. Men too. the sound of civilization unraveling. Inside, Elwine returned to her desk. Her quill trembled as she wrote, * 3 spoonfuls blood. Flame. Vinegar compress. Slight relief noted, *. No miracles. Just resistance. On the shelf above her parchment sat a vial of monk's hood, the label faded, marked only with a symbol, a circle split in two. Death or sleep, that was the choice. That had always been the choice. She reached for another vial, one with nothing but dried rose petals inside. It had no use, but she kept it. A reminder. Of color. Of beauty. Of a world before. And as she lit another candle, wax hissing over the iron plate, she paused. The flame caught her eye, a perfect gold tear in a room full of darkness. She exhaled slowly. This was not triumph. This was not hope. This was something older. Harder. Persistence. The ink of survival was dark. But it could still be read. And somewhere just beyond the convent walls, thunder murmured low, like a warning or a promise. The air grew colder. The hour moved forward. And so did she. The sky over the cloister was bruised, a violet gray that bled into the hills like an infection. The wind had grown strange. It carried not the scent of rain or herbs but something older, something spoiled. And as the bells lay silent in their tower, as the ink dried in the cold margins of abandoned books, Brother Ranulph stood alone in the garden he had once called sacred. Fennel, sage, marigold, hyssop, they had grown in obedient lines rose straight as scripture. His hands had known every leaf, every root, as if the plants themselves whispered to him. He had believed that order was a shield, that if the body was cleansed and the air sweetened, no darkness could pierce it. But the plague did not listen. It came first as a cough behind the refectory wall, then a fever in the novitiate dormitory, then blackened limbs under the robes of the devout, and then, the rats, wild-eyed, brazen, running through grain like fire through dry straw. They brought more than teeth. They brought silence. The kind that grows behind doors nailed shut. The kind that cannot be scrubbed away with vinegar or lime. Now the garden was dying. Leaves curled inward like clenched hands. The soil, once rich and fragrant, had soured to mud and ash. Still, Brother Ranulph knelt there at dawn and dusk, crushing dried marigold petals into water thick with mildew. The petals stained his fingertips yellow, a memory of light he could no longer feel. He had read everything. Hildegard's visions, Galen's humors, Avicenna's remedies, written in languages older than his fear. But none of it held. Not against this. He boiled angelica root in goat's milk, steeped lichen until it bled green into spirits, burned sulfur beneath beds that no longer held the living. The abbey reeked, of fire, of mildew, of sour bread and stale wine. A smell of holy places undone. One night, with the moon hidden behind cloud, he stepped into the chapel to find a rat on the altar. Its eyes were white. Its mouth half open as if laughing. He didn't scream. He didn't pray. He scooped the thing with trembling hands, cast it into the brazier, and watched it curl in on itself like a dying flame. Then he wept, not from fear but from the weight of watching purity fall to ruin. They buried the abbot the next morning. No procession, no chant, just the dull sound of shovels. Ranulph chose the rosemary bush, the one the abbot had trimmed each spring while humming psalms that no one else remembered. Into the abbot's mouth Ranulph placed a sprig of thyme. In his hands a bundle of rue. Not for medicine. For memory. He whispered no Latin, only a phrase his mother once said before bed, "Guard what sleeps." Hope had narrowed. To inches. To the heat of a forehead still warm. To the sound of another breath in the dark. He no longer sought cures. Only moments. In the scriptorium the pages were stiff with cold. He lit no candle. Instead, he dipped a reed into a near-frozen pot of ink and wrote one word into the corner of an old healer's manuscript. A book passed from monk to monk like an heirloom of belief. He wrote, "Listen." It was not instruction. It was surrender. To the soil beneath his knees. To the air between each breath. To the silence that sat beside the dead, never turning away. Because he had learned, too late perhaps, that the root did not always save. The chant did not always cure. The flame did not always purge. But presence could become its own kind of healing. To stay when others fled. To wash the body when no one else would. To whisper a name when memory tried to erase it. Outside, the wind stirred the dead stalks of hyssop. A bee, half mad and out of season, hovered briefly, then vanished into the hollow of the stone wall. Somewhere beyond the cloister, a cart rolled over gravel, the sound soft as cloth tearing. Brother Ranulph stood in his garden, now more grave than sanctuary, and breathed the smoke-heavy air. He did not ask for salvation, only to remain long enough to witness what came next.